Let me start out by saying that if anyone claims that believing in a bodily resurrection of Jesus is not essential to the true meaning of Christianity, that individual has gone on a picnic without their basket. They are just simply dazed and confused. New Testament Christianity stands or falls on the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus from Nazareth. Otherwise, we have no logical reason for assembling here this morning and me receiving a paycheck for standing up here and looking mighty pretty. You cannot separate having a faith in the New Testament gospel from the Christ of history. To speak of the resurrection faith without the resurrection facts is like trying to live on a second floor of a two-story house when the first floor has been removed. Any faith that rejects the great spiritual truth of the resurrection is based on a flimsy or a false foundation. That requires one to adopt a new type of concept, which would be devastating if followed in any other field. For example, we might prefer the inventor's trials and methods of inventing gunpowder than to just simply memorize the formula. Meaning, if we were on a battlefield, we would want to know that the gunpowder invented would actually work when I pull the trigger. Of Jesus, we want to know not only about his life, but also about his power. We could have loved him if his body had remained in the tomb forever as being a very kind and wonderful teacher nearly 2,000 years ago. Several disciples loved him, and thinking that he was dead, they were going to anoint his crucified body on Sunday when they discovered the empty tomb, not knowing that it wouldn't be very long and they would see him again alive. So we could love him in the grave, but sooner or later, Jesus would be treated by us as any other great leader still dead, such as Washington or Lincoln. We could honor his precious memory, but we would go our own way, having a loss of involvement about his life as other dead but great men and women. Like Peter, we could go back to fishing as life goes on. We could continue to be his admirers as a lot of his teaching made sense to follow. It was very positive in how to deal with other people as well as with self. Christianity, as revealed in the scriptures, tells of Jesus both as a matchless teacher of spiritual truth, as well as the ultimate worker of every type of miracle over nature, even raising the dead. Now, modern man finds it easy to praise Jesus as a teacher of handy truths, while finding fault with the idea that he performed true miracles, but was just some sideshow trickery of magic. Yet the character of Jesus and the nature of his teachings provides equal proof of his miraculous nature. The character of Jesus is one of the greatest wonders of all time, living his whole life without one sin. Well, how could one believe in Jesus without believing Jesus has all power on earth as well as in heaven? Which brings us to our question. Does the resurrection essentially work? Was he raised from the dead? At least 6 different New Testament writers say that he was. And in the process, they name others who claim to have witnessed him alive after being securely buried in a rich man's tomb. Now, the modern critics, they like to reply and say, well, these people were biased. The skeptic cries out, show us impartial witnesses, and we will believe. Well, how can there be impartial witnesses? There could be dishonest witnesses, but to ask for an impartial witness is to demand people who were there to remain impartial and yet testify that the resurrection happened. One must choose a side, be a believer or a non-believer, being very partial. The facts remain that witnesses both for the empty tomb and the resurrected body were willing to put these claims in writing almost 30 years later after the event was believed. Mark's gospel, by most scholars, is the first one written, and that would be the early 60 AD, up to basically 63. Now further, these same witnesses were being imprisoned, or even worse things would happen to them for making these claims within just a few years after the establishment of New Testament Christianity in the book of Acts. The resurrection of Jesus as a historical event is well documented, though modern thought is full of doubt to accept the recorded evidence as fact. These are the people who still question if there was a Holocaust or if astronauts actually landed on the moon. Skeptics maintain a position of assuming a gigantic fraud was committed by those who had something to gain. Now, in addition to New Testament writers, we have the following facts substantiated by secular history. A Roman historian named Suduni in AD 88 reports that Claudius had expelled from Rome the Jews who were under the influence of Christos. Now, since Claudius died in AD 54, we have evidence of the life of Jesus and his influence by the time not more than 20 years after he was reported to die in Jerusalem. Another Roman historian, Tacitus, writing before AD 120, reports that Christians derived their name from Christos, who suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate. Then you had a Jewish historian named Josephus. He's an eyewitness of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. In his writings, he makes two references to Jesus. Now, is it not rather strange how these non-Christian sources reveal historical proof that Jesus did live at the time that the four Gospels claim, and that their writings are in harmony with the details that are found in the New Testament? He was crucified by Pilate, and within just years his disciples were proclaiming these beliefs at the risk of persecution. The inspired New Testament writers made 6 following bold claims: that Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem during the rule of Pilate, that Jesus was buried in a tomb which had not been previously used, that on the 3rd day after the crucifixion, disciples found the tomb empty, having been guarded by angels, that beginning on the same day, Jesus appeared to his disciples and continued for a period of 40 days. That after the 40 days, he ascended to heaven, and after the ascension, he appeared to at least 2 other disciples, Stephen as well as Saul of Tarsus, who would later become known as the Apostle Paul. So in our lesson this morning, we are going to consider the first 3 claims as they relate to the empty tomb, what is said on the first 3, will have a bearing on the claim that Jesus appeared to his disciples. So let us begin with the empty tomb, since there is less danger of misunderstanding of what is being claimed. Now the skeptics will attempt to undercut the claim of the witnesses by trying to make all the resurrection appearances explainable as subjective experiences, meaning it's coming from the mind only and not from external verification. The claim of the empty tomb provides no positive subjective loopholes. It is simply either true or false, one or the other. So let us consider the possible alternatives to the claim of the four Gospels that it was empty because God had raised Jesus from the dead. Let's just put that on the back burner for now and not even look at that, but let's examine first the other possibilities. Now here they are. One, that the disciples stole the body. Two, that Jesus was not dead in the tomb, but was revived and somehow managed to get out. Number three, that the enemies stole the body. And number four, that the disciples made the mistake about the location. Now, since the first two explanations involve falsehoods on the part of either Jesus or his disciples, we must first consider the possibility that either Jesus or his disciples had anything to gain by proclaiming such lies. The only response recorded by the enemies of Jesus for a long time was the claim that his disciples stole the body. This is the report that was found in the Gospels, and it is the only written explanation to be found in Jewish writings for the next few centuries. Now remember, these are the ungodly religious leaders of the Jewish nation. So after taking counsel in Matthew chapter 28, verse 12 and 13, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, his disciples came by night and stowed him away while you were all asleep." Now anyone who's ever been in the military knows you do not fall asleep on guard duty. Also, if everyone is all asleep at the same time, how do you know who took the body? Because you're sawing logs or counting sheep. The biggest problem with this answer, as with any claim which accounts for the rise of Christianity through deception, is that people who proclaimed the empty tomb were soon being persecuted to the greatest extreme for their new religion that they knew was a falsehood, having stolen the body. Those who have worked for any cause realize how hard it is to get people to suffer persecution for what they believe to be true, much less for what they know to be a colossal lie. If the disciples stole the body, then proclaimed that God had raised Jesus, they would be doing what most believers today would not do. That was to risk their lives for an absolute falsehood. Are any of you here this morning because you are convinced that the resurrection story is a hoax? Of course not. I didn't think so. You have studied it and know, otherwise you would not be here. Furthermore, the explanation implies that a religion which stresses honesty, sincerity, conviction, and love has for its foundation a deception from the devil which betrays honesty and sincerity while undermining the possibility of conviction and love. There is no indication that those proclaiming Christianity ever compromised with Satan over such a sham. That is, they ever used dishonest methods for this good cause. There is no evidence any of the apostles from Acts chapter 2 on ever wavered in conviction to the point of giving up their New Testament faith in the resurrection. It is significant that the Jews could think of no better explanation that the disciples stole the body. Another possibility is called the swoon theory. It holds that while Jesus, he was not dead when they placed him in the tomb, and that inside the tomb he regained strength and succeeded to get out of there as a picture of good health. He escaped without any of the soldiers seeing him, though all the guards were wide awake. Jesus then appears to the disciples, and he convinces them to preach the good news that is found in the New Testament. Now think, this interpretation transfers the deception to Jesus. And it does not explain why the disciples were willing to die for that which they knew was not true, Jesus having died, as he stands before them after having rested very peacefully in the tomb. It must harmonize with the most ethical, non-self-serving doctrine that is found in the Sermon on the Mount, with the founder who was aware that he was penetrating a false fraud and not dying on the cross. This is in complete out of character with the Jesus that we read about throughout the four Gospels. The account given by the Gospel writers would prevent this possibility, for they record that a large stone sealed the tomb, and two, that armed guards were set to stop any effort from anyone who chose to take or steal the body that was dead. Now this brings us to the conclusion that either the gospel writers told the truth, two, lied, or three, did not know what occurred. The issue again comes down to how reliable are the gospel writers. Listen to what the Apostle John wrote in his book, chapter 19, verse 31 to 34. The Jews, therefore, because it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, and that they might be taken away. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other man who was crucified with him. But coming to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately there came out blood and water. Now the purpose of breaking the legs was to hurry up death. No longer able to raise self up on the cross in order to take in life-saving oxygen, one would die of suffocation and of not breathing in, but just dying from its own carbon dioxide that was building up in his blood as well as lungs. Jesus' legs were not broken, but a soldier, he thrust a spear under his rib cage, penetrating Jesus' heart. Unbroken legs and piercing him fulfilled two Old Testament prophecies. Psalms 34, verse 20, Zechariah 12, verse 10. It was then reported to Pilate by a Roman centurion, a trained killer, that Jesus was indeed dead. Mark chapter 15, verse 44. When people were scourged severely and crucified, they did not come off the cross alive in the first century. Well, how about the enemies of the Nazarene? They stole the body. This explanation lacks any motivation. You see, they wanted to keep Jesus in the tomb until after the third day they could gather around the gravesite, roll back the stone, and produce a very dead, decaying Jesus, and have proven that the low-life carpenter was just another false Messiah that hoodwinked the foolish, lower-class, uneducated Jews. The Jewish leaders of the Sanhedrin, they could exalt themselves with, "We always know what is best for you." It was not at all plausible for it to be the enemies, nor thieves, because grave robbers do not steal worthless bodies. Think for a minute. The tomb is closed with a large rock rolled over the open tomb. Armed Roman guards have been posted to cause a problem for disciples, enemies, or even thieves to remove the body of Jesus. Well, some advocate that the disciples were mistaken about the location of the tomb. The argument is that the women who went there early Sunday morning were so emotionally drained from the events on Friday, having witnessed Jesus suffer and his death, they now arrive at the wrong tomb. Now, Joseph of Arimathea, he is the tomb's owner. He knew its location. In Matthew's gospel, he says in verse 59 and 60 of Matthew chapter 27, "And Jesus took the body and laid it in his own tomb. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, sitting opposite the grave." Now, Mark also has some information. He says in chapter 15, verse 47, that both Marys were looking on to see where he was laid. Now, the two Marys, they brought spices and perfumes to anoint the body. And then we find also, Mark says in chapter 16, verse 2, "And very early on the first day of the week," that's Sunday, "they came to the tomb when the sun had risen." So they go inside and they see an angel that talks to them. Mark 16, verse 6. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen and is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him." The angel points out the exact location where Jesus had laid earlier. Both Marys went to the right tomb. In John chapter 20, verse 1 to 8, you got Peter and John. They did not go to the wrong tomb either. It was empty, yet it had grave wrappings inside. The body is gone, but the grave wrappings remain. So logic demands that had to be Jesus' tomb. The soldiers, having been guarding the right tomb since Friday through Saturday, the Sabbath, came and told the Jewish leaders early Sunday morning that the tomb was now empty. Matthew 28, verse 11. Now, if all of the disciples on different occasions on Sunday were mistaken about the location of the tomb, you know that the Jewish enemies of Jesus would have corrected them because they knew precisely where the tomb was. You know, it's interesting that the Pharisee by the name of Saul of Tarsus, he is a major enemy of Jesus. He was bent on destroying this movement called Christianity that embraced the resurrection of Christ. He literally hated this Jesus for deceiving the Jewish people, which Saul is sworn to protect, being a Hebrew of Hebrews. Now, in Acts chapter 9, walking to Damascus to gather up the disciples of the Lord for punishment, Saul has a one-on-one confrontation with someone that is supposed to be dead and buried. he has his own come to Jesus meeting. He became a believer in the resurrection of Christ on the road to Damascus. Though he is not as of yet a saved believer. He is led into the city, and 3 days, being in blindness, Paul reflects upon his life in prayer and fasting. He is in a repenting mode with sorrow for all the harm that he had done to Jesus and the Lord's New Testament church. Then a Christian by the name of Ananias comes to Saul and tells him what he still lacks in becoming a New Testament Christian. He arose and was baptized, Acts chapter 9, verse 18. And we find from Acts chapter 22, verse 16, he was baptized in order to have his sins washed away. Now I said all that to say this. Later in his life, now as the Apostle Paul, he begins to write epistles. And there is so much that hinges on Paul's testimony concerning the facts of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. As in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 and 4. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Even more sufficiently essential is still in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul claims that Christ is the first fruits of the resurrection of the saints. He says in verse 23, but each in his own order. Christ, the first fruits. After that, those who are Christ at his coming. Now, a fellow by the name of George Eldon Ladd, in his book, I Believe in the Resurrection of Jesus, is precisely correct on this point of verse 23. This is what he says. First fruits is more than a blossoming with its promise of fruitage. It is more than green fruit with the assurance of a large crop. It was the actual beginning of the harvest itself, with the certainty of much more of the same grain shortly to follow. Throughout 1 Corinthians 15, Paul elaborates on the doctrine of the second coming. And although he stresses a glorified body, it is like a seed that produces a beautiful plant only after it has been planted in the ground. This glorified body is the one which will be raised from the dead. It is the resurrected body, but it is not the disembodied spirit. Paul expected to be with Christ after death in a disembodied spirit. But the resurrection is yet in the future, where he will receive his glorified body. The significance is this for the saints. In Paul's teaching, will later be raised bodily, although in a transformed, non-physical body at the resurrection. As the first fruits indicate that the harvest has already begun, meaning the bodily resurrection of Jesus has previously occurred. So the resurrection of Jesus was first. And then there will be one general resurrection of all the saints as well as of all the lost at the end of this current Christian age during the Lord's second advent. Paul stressed that Jesus died, was buried, arose, and then appeared to the disciples. Paul and all the disciples can be shown to have started proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus immediately once they witnessed this fact. Now let us consider the evidence of the last three claims of the inspired writers. Remember earlier that the first three were that Jesus was crucified under Pilate, that he was buried in the tomb, And then on the third day, the disciples found his tomb empty. Now the last three claim which concern his appearances to his disciples, either individuals or groups that were witnesses to Jesus him being very alive after being placed dead in the tomb. The early disciples believed from given evidence that Jesus appeared bodily to them and impressed on them the conviction that he had risen from the tomb. How do I know? Well, because they clinged to him. They touched his wounds. They even ate a meal with him. Now, critics are unable to give a logical answer to the empty tomb. They will now, in their attempt to discredit the witnesses by suggesting that they were unstable in their thinking or they were hallucinating. Now back to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, now verse 5 to 8. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it were, to one unkindly born, he appeared to me also. Now, if you remember, in the garden tomb area, Jesus also appeared to a few female disciples. That's in Luke chapter 24, verse 10. So the skeptics want us to believe that during each of these different occasions, even the one sighting of over 500 brethren, that the disciples, for one reason or another, were not in their right mind to literally see things as they truly were, but were all delusional, suffering from a mental disorder. That's what they're telling you to believe, to accept that none of these people knew literally what they were seeing. In Acts chapter 1, you have about 120 disciples of Jesus gathered in Jerusalem waiting for the kingdom to come. And Peter speaks about selecting a replacement apostle for Judas in chapter 122, beginning with the baptism of John until the day that he was taken up from us. One of these should be a witness with us of his resurrection. So one of the requirements to be an apostle was to have seen the resurrected Jesus. Chapter 1, verse 26. And the lot fell to Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. Of the 120 in that upper room, I would reason that many of this group had seen Jesus very much alive after the Passover Sabbath, during the next 40 days when Jesus was making his appearances. The reality is that they literally saw a bodily resurrected Jesus, and the result was this was an overwhelming sight. Without wavering, they went forth and they turned the world upside down, singing with praise on their smile, with a smile, as they were persecuted to death. We start out with reading from John chapter 11. Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live even if he dies. And everyone who believes in me, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Now that was John 11, verse 25. Now I like what he says to her next in verse 26. Do you believe this? Martha was given a choice of either yes or no. Verse 27. Yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God. Question is, will you make that same confession this morning? Having believed Jesus is the resurrection. Will you repent and be baptized to wash your sins away as Saul of Tarsus? After he was told by Jesus, enter the city, and it shall be told you what you must do. Acts 9, verse 5. Remember the Christian named Ananias, he comes and he commands Saul, be baptized. Will you do this morning what Saul did many centuries ago? Arise and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. If you need to respond that way, come right now, and we'll take care of that. Together we stand.